Hey everyone, we're going to look at number 7 in section 1.3 of Achieve. So it's a little bit tricky. We have two functions, very similar to number 6. F of t is 4 divided by square root of t, and g of t is negative t squared. So be careful, this is -1 times t squared. Notice exponents happen before multiplying by -1, so you really have to square t first and then multiply by -1 here. So make sure you understand what that means. We're going to find f circle g and g circle f, as well as their domain for each of those. Now you want to pay careful attention to the instructions in the parentheses. Okay, and we'll remind you of that here in a minute. When we look at the function f of t, what's its domain? Well, the square root of t, the value of t here, since we're under the radical, right, taking the square root, that must be non-negative, must be greater than or equal to 0. However, since we're dividing by it, it cannot be 0 because division by 0 is undefined. Hence, the domain is everything greater than 0. For the function g of t, again, as I said, squaring t and then multiplying by -1, right? So again, this really is the same thing as -1 times t squared. Well, I can square any number and then change and then multiply by -1. So the domain here is all real numbers. Okay, so let's look at f circle g first. F circle g of t is f of g of t. So g of t, if you remember, is negative t squared. And then I'm plugging that into the function f. So whatever I plug into the function f, I take 4 and I divide it by the square root of that input. So I've got 4 divided by the square root of what's the input? Negative t squared. Now, this is a little interesting expression. You've got to be careful. Some students will say, well, I can just simplify because the square root of negative t squared is just t or negative t or something like that. Well, that's not correct. Okay, this is the simplest you can get this expression. There is a problem with this expression. When we talk about what's the domain of this function, what can it possibly be? Well, notice g of t, right? We start with g of t. Its domain is all real numbers. So you're saying, well, there's no problem there. We can plug anything in and get something. Yes, that's true. But what comes out of the function g of t has to be something that's in the domain of the function f, which is only numbers greater than 0, only positive values. And here's the problem. G of t, what's its range? What's its output? Its domain's all real numbers. But when I plug any number in, I square it, right, first. Squaring it will always make it non-negative. Okay, that means it will always be greater than or equal to 0. And then what happens? I multiply it by -1. Well, now it's less than or equal to 0. So the output to g of t are only values less than or equal to 0. And the domain here, what we're plugging into f, is greater than 0. You see there's no value of t that I can plug in to this composition function and get a real number. And so the domain really is what we would say the empty set. The interval there's no values in the set. And if you read that parentheses, you'll see that they say to use this symbol in that case if the interval is empty, they say, right? If there's no value of t in the domain actually. So this is not a very good composition function. It's not helpful because there's no value of t I can plug into it. And you can see that because when I plug in any value of t, I'm going to square it and then immediately multiply it by -1. So it's either going to be 0, which again, I can't divide by 0, or it will be the square root of some negative number, which is again, not a real number. Okay, that's a little tricky. Hope that makes sense. If we go the other direction, it's not quite as bad. G circle f of t is g of f of t. F of t, remember, is 4 divided by the square root of t. Now I'm going to plug that into the function g, which means I'm going to square it, right? And then multiply by -1. So be careful. Negative t squared, again, is not the same thing as negative t quantity squared. So this negative sign shouldn't be inside, right? The parentheses. Okay. So I can square 4, I get 16. And what is the square root of t squared? Well, the square root of t squared is just t. And so here's my nice expression for my composition function g circle f of t. Now, what's the domain for this function? If you just looked at this by itself, you'd say, well, I can plug anything in except for 0. I can plug any positive or negative number into this, but that's not the domain, because remember, we start with the function f of t, and what was its domain? Only positive numbers. So that's going to restrict me, right, to only the positive numbers. Okay. Remember the function g, we don't have a problem in terms of what's plugged in there because its domain is all real numbers, but we're starting with f of t in this composition. So there is the domain for that composition function. Okay, this is a little tricky with these ones. I hope this clarifies things.